It was a condition that altered them. The question now was not whether he would tell, but how he would live with what that telling might make of the city he loved and of the family that depended on him. When he turned to go, Edda tapped his sleeve and handed him a slip of paper folded into a thin, secret crevice. On it was written in a hand he recognized as her own a phrase that functioned as both admonition and benediction: name the dead, but tend the living. As he walked out into the night, the rain thickened. The lamplight smeared into the wet air. Behind him, in the warm rooms of the scriptorium, their small conspiracy began to vivify into motion. Lists were copied, inks were mixed to a careful age. Dispatches were prepared for the convent and for a guild clerk in the old quarter. In the sound of wheels far off and the nearer drip of rain, Matthias heard the thin, certain pulse of a deadline approaching. He had confessed. He had counsel. He had made a plan that would either loosen memory's hold or provoke a fury that would demand braver reckonings than any of them had bargained for. The last thing that the chapter kept was a sound like a closing hing, the outer gate as it swung shut. It sounded final and also provisional. The city's sleep would hold for a while, and there was a grace in the pause. But under the pause lay the ledger's breath, and under that breath, the hum of a chronicle about to be sanctified. When public ritual presses down, small acts of dissent become hotter beneath the skin. Matthias understood this with a clarity that made his hands numb. The action had been taken, the cost had been incurred, the night held its breath. The morning would decide whether that breath was a prayer or a warning. Matthias arrived at the convent with the leaden weight of his decision lodged in the tender part of his chest that used to be able to take comfort in rules. He had been careful in the daytime, slow as a worm uncoiling, mild as a clerk copying a ledger, but at night his thoughts walked their own dangerous roads. The chapter house received him as a small room of light in a dark city. Candles burned in sconces arranged along the walls. The wicks bent, oval flames that practiced a modest, deliberate sway. The air smelled of beeswax and old leather, and the faint metallic suggestion of iron in the pipes below, where the censors kept their boxes. Outside, the city scraped and shuffled itself toward bed. Within, a different economy of sound ruled, the soft rustle of cloaks, the scratch of pen on parchment, hands moving in agreement or dissent like small birds on a branch. He had expected solitude and found instead a counsel. Edda sat nearest the window, where a slit of moonlight fell like a pale coin and silvered one side of her face. She folded and refolded a slip of paper, as if the movement could iron the problem into place. Sister Anwen, grey-veiled and narrower with age than memory allowed, arranged several leaves before her as one would prepare a modest meal, because that is what they were doing here, preparing sustenance for a truth that had gone hungry. Captain Ryan leant against the stone, his boots close to the hearth, where the candlelight turned metal into moments of softness. Maravel hovered by the door, alert as a hawk yet as nervous as a bird on the wing. Their shadows made a second table across the flagstones. There was no ceremony to convene them beyond need and the muttered promise of secrecy. Anwen had asked only that sentences be measured and that hands be steady when they touched the page. The convent's ledger room, once modest in its holdings and now a small sanctuary for what the state had declared inconvenient, had become the place where the dead kept knocking on the living's door. Matthias felt the knocks as sharp as any bell. "We have little time," Edda said, with a tone that admitted cold calculation and no show of prayer. "The Chancellor has begun to send clearer signs. They search couriers with less pretense. Galen was called 3 days ago. He has not yet returned to full vigor. That is not coincidence." Matthias glanced at Sister Anwen. The nun's mouth was a thin line. She was a woman who had learned to say prayers without loudness, to make the small words count. "Orders come from Varan," she said quietly. "Not always in his hand. Sometimes a magistrate, sometimes a merchant who fears disruption. They prefer their instruments to be bright and sudden, burning, confiscation, a slow rewrite." The chronicle will be made clean. Clean is a particular kind of violence. The phrase was an H he recognized. He had spent his work hours polishing the chronicle until its surfaces shone. It had been his trade to buff out the burrs and stains of the past, so that the present might not see those jagged things. To call that procedure violence made his stomach clench. His own history had been smoothed, his family's survival attested to by omission. To name the cost of that smoothness aloud felt like tearing a seam in his own skin. "What do you propose?" Mara asked, impatience and hunger braided into the question. She moved as if she could not wait for words to become action. Markets didn't wait for counsel. Do we fling this at the city and watch what falls? Or do we whisper it into enough ears that it cannot be snuffed out? "We cannot simply throw the ledger into the square," Ryan said. "I have seen what happens when the crown has a thread to pull. They find the man who threw it, and they make his family into an example. The city will bleed and then be closed with a law and a new oath. That would satisfy Varren, and the names would be forgotten under the new violence." Ryan's voice was the kind that carried both the weight of muscle and the clean logic of someone who had watched a thing burn. Matthias liked that about him, the soldier's straightforward arithmetic, where each act had a measurable cost. But it also frightened him, because Ryan's assessments were often the last stop on a road that ended in action rather than apology. They spoke then in low ways that did not need secrecy so much as care. Edda suggested marginalia, an argument for the subtle over the spectacular. A marginal note could be smuggled into a text, because the text itself necessarily bore marginalia. It could look like an erratum or a clerical gloss, something the scribe had misplaced or misjudged. If the marginal note bore names and cross-references, then the chronicle, the instrument of legitimacy, would also hold an instrument for remembrance. But the Chancellor's men will hunt every marginal note like wolves, Mara said. They will claim the hand is a forger's. The market and tavern know forgeries as well as they know truth. Jasper can make any seal sing, and men will believe his hand as readily as another's. "We know that," Edda answered. She did not flinch at the word Jasper. She used it as one uses a splinter to make a wound manageable. But authenticity is a craft. A seal isn't proof alone. The record's provenance, the context of where it is found, who carried it, and how it is copied, these are the things that make a thing endure. Ryan considered that, fingers to his mouth as if tasting strategy. "We need both authenticity and redundancy," he said. "One appendix in the chronicle will not survive their attention. But if multiple trustworthy copies, markets, soldiers hold versions, the state cannot quickly erase them all. The story will leak into many vessels. The memory will not be a single candle to be snuffed, it will be a string of lights. Why trust convents and markets?" Matthias asked. His voice surprised him. It carried a trembling edge that he tried to hide by taking a slow breath. The markets are gossip. Convents are sanctified silence. The chronicle will be controlled with priests on one side and censors on the other. "Because those are the places where memory lives," Sister Anwin replied. "Convents keep what the state would prefer burned for the sake of order. Markets keep what the state would prefer named as rumor, so they may dismiss it. Together they make a net. A net is not proof, but it is a sanctuary." They began to map the plan, like men marking a course across a field full of hidden fences. Hours of talk narrowed into a sequence. First, Matthias would compose a marginal appendix. It would name the betrayed and record the ledger's entries with careful, precise language that made no grand accusation, but stated facts in the tone of a clerical edition. It would include dates, sums, and a short note about provenance, a cross-reference to a ledger leaf now hidden in the convent. That phrasing was important. It was less a public indictment than an archival footnote, which strengthened it precisely because footnotes are the bones historians like to pick at. Second, Edda would arrange for the scribed edition to be physically inserted into the official chronicle. at a moment when the scriptorium's attention and the ritual cadence of copying made such an insertion plausible. That would be the dangerous act, to place the appendix into the state's book. Third, Sister Anwen would oversee the production of authenticated copies. Convents had trustworthy hands and the ability to produce duplicates in ways that bore institutional relevance. The copies could be sealed with odd marks, sewn into hymnals, slipped in with confessional lists small enough to be overlooked by the heavy-handed, but persistent enough to be read by those who needed to read them. Fourth, Mara would distribute lists in the markets and among survivors' houses, relying on a network of women who had outlived sons or husbands, and who ran the city's arteries of gossip as carefully as any magistrate ran ledgers. Ryan would secure couriers and provide protection for those who might be targeted, a shadow guard for memory. Finally, they would prepare for the rout that would surely come. Varron would respond. His men would search and burn. They agreed it was better for some of the names to survive in private hands than for none to exist publicly at all. The plan was, in its way, an admission that truth could not simply be given back in a single clean sheet. It had to be planted in many soils so that some root might take. The moral arguments were slow and thorny. Matthias worried about the possibility that their intervention might kill. "We are not just changing ink," he said. "We are changing lives. If the Chancellor reacts with force, then people will die because of what we did. Is that our burden to place on them?" His fingers worried a corner of his sleeve until the cloth gathered between his nails. Edda's answer was a teacher's patience. If we do nothing, people die anyway. They die in a different way, erased, uncounted. The choice is not between safety and violence. The choice is between which violence we will bear. To refuse memory is to let the state decide who is human enough to be remembered. Ryan's voice was the blunt instrument a soldier's sorrow makes. To hold a name costs you nothing if you are not the one to pay. But there is no piety in hiding from the consequence. If they come with iron and garrote, part of being a survivor is choosing which you're willing to keep safety for kin or the accounting of the dead. I am willing to be counted for this. Mara's rage was a neat blade. My father is a name on your ledger. Does that make my life less valuable? My mother's hands have prepared bread for men who would call her son a traitor. The city keeps its mouth shut for its comfort. Shame is not a good enough reason to keep the ledger folding in some clerk's desk. A silence followed, large enough to hear the convent bell marking some private hour. Matthias felt each heartbeat as a small thing in a world that had always favored the loud and the visible. His family was small. His mother had a cough that came like rain in spring. To move would put them in a position to be punished. He had thought of accepting an offered redaction, of letting an amnesty paper be clamped across his family's name, so they might live without the scrape of suspicion. Tonight, in the convent, those possibilities felt like ointments applied to a festering wound. He could not make an honest peace with them. Who will write it? Sister Anwen asked, and the question hung with the weight of practical knowledge. The hand matters. It will be proof or joke, depending on whose script the inspectors trust. They looked at him. Mathis' chest tightened. He had tried to imagine refusal and the way the world would go on believing that the Chronicle had been a flawless thing. He had tried to imagine action and the world taking him for its scapegoat. Both imaginations were vivid and bruising. He remembered early days in the scriptorium, how he learned the scribe's art, the curl of the T in a clerical hand, the way a particular ink would sink into vellum and come to rest, and never look the same again. He had thought of himself as a neutral agent in a machine that prided itself on neutralities. Now he realized there are no neutralities in archives. The space between technique and truth is short and occupied by someone making a choice. "I will write it," he said at last. His voice was softer than he felt. "I will make the marginal note. I will make it limpid and dry. It will state names and sums and a reference to a ledger. No accusation, just data." Let the data hold the weight. Edda's eyes narrowed, then widened in something like relief. Because your position in the scriptorium is still a small trust, she said. They are less likely to suspect you of rebellion and more likely to assume clerical error. We can use what the state trusts to deliver what it does not. They set to the details, the timing, the seals, the codicils that would give their work an appearance of institutional gravitas. Sister Anwen would train 2 novices to copy a safe number of authenticated pages. Edda would smuggle slips soon into hymnals. Ryan would take a sealed packet under his coat to the old soldiers and leave it in the chest of a man who buried names on a stone he visited every week. Mara would fold lists small enough to be hidden in the lining of aprons and handed to market women with the kind of business that would guard them with a scowl rather than a proclamation. They argued about signs of authenticity. Would a seal from the scriptorium be proof, or a folly that Varen would decree as fake? Jasper's name returned like a fly into the room. His skill made forgery too easy, and yet the forger was a man who knew the scriptorium's muscle. Edda decided on an odd mark, a stitch pattern in the binding different from the Chronicle's standard. A phrase in Latin that was not customary in official glosses, but would sit perfectly into the hands of a scholar who knew convent syntax. They argued terms like provenance and appendix with the fervor of conspirators mapping a small country's borders. Outside the window, a bell tolled. The hour pulled at them like a tide. When racks of minutes had been allocated and each man and woman had a job, Sister Anwen rose and moved to the hearth. She took a small bowl of cold water and dabbed at the candle wax that had run onto the table. "We have something else to consider," she said, eyes on Matthias. "Not everyone will want the names to be known. Some survivors prefer silence. We are imposing memory. Memory is not always a kindness." Matthias had rehearsed his answer and then found a different truth. "We are restoring a ledger," he said. "We are not demanding vengeance. We are making space for names. Those who want to forget will be able to. Those who need to remember must have the means." They made their choices. The appendix would avoid rhetorical flourish. It would be strictly documentary. They would avoid incendiary language and leave the interpretation to the reader's judgment. They would not call for arrest, revenge, or any public action. If the state used names for its own justice, then the book had done its duty. It had named. If people acted, the book could not be held to that action. It was a small absolution of sorts, and it comforted none of them fully. Matthias sat back and felt his shoulders tremble a little. Mr. Gallen's lectures about institutional ethics came to him in the form of that old man's worry-lined face. Galen would have cautioned patience, method, perhaps the slow accumulation of proof rather than guerrilla insertion. But a daily life had a tempo. Institutions that ruled by silence had a cruelty that worked in the rhythms of a day. Sometimes mercy demanded urgency. They placed the ledger leaf between them then, a small piece of paper with rows of numbers and names. It looked ordinary, which made it monstrous. Sister Anwen slid a finger lightly across it, as if to reassure that the paper would not. Matthias woke to the sound of chains clinking and the slow, official rumble of cartwheels on cobble. For a moment he thought he had dreamed the scriptorium alive, voices reading names and titles as if at prayer, the cadence oddly liturgical. He sat in the dark and listened, the familiar little noises of his life dragged into their new register, and felt the first true fury of fear that had not been personal but institutional. It announced itself not as a raw emotion but as a tightening of every sinew, the notion that the paper he loved, which had been a refuge and a weapon in the same breath, could be made to stop breathing. From his window he could see a column of men moving past the palace eaves, their lanterns bobbing like heavy muths. They bore the governor's insignia dark blue, an emblem of the Chronicle stitched upon cloaks, and with them moved a detachment of clerks, young men in tabards, faces drawn with duty and dread, pulling wheeled presses and carts with iron clasps. A banner floated ahead by order of the Chancellor, archival purge for state security. The words might have been calm in print. Spoken aloud, they were an execution. Matthias dressed with hands that trembled. He had not slept hours, had been spent on copying, on recomposing fragile proofs, yet some small logic in him demanded that he be awake for any crisis that might touch the soft, private work of the scriptorium. He took his satchel, wrapped in cloth, felt the reassuring bulk of folded folios there. A pulse of grief licked along his throat at the idea that it might be the last time he touched certain pages he had copied by candlelight. On the stair he met Galen in the vestibule. The master's face was grey and hollow, his hands folded as if to keep from making sudden gestures. "They have lists," Galen said without surprise, and that lack of surprise felt like betrayal of the worst order. Names, sections, official deaccession. Matthias wanted to ask if Galen would help, if the old man would resist, or if he would show the weakness of men who live by institution. But Galen's glance was not pleading. He was a man who had taught the rules of a mission in 1,000 small ways. He had turned those rules into the scriptorium's bones. "We must secure what we can," Galen added, and the sentence contained the wary acceptance of someone who had known the slow corrosion of archives into instruments of power. "Get to your desks, Matt. The lists are long. We will be obliged to comply and to watch." Comply, Matthias thought. Observe the blessed fire and say nothing. He moved through the rooms where the presses had lain quiet for years, where parchment and vellum waited in drawers. He could hear the torch's first hiss from the courtyard, a wet sound like meat on stone. Men gathered, lean-faced, and an official read the proclamation. He read what the proclamation had to cover: sedition, unauthorized materials, inflammatory pamphleteering, foreign subversion. The language was designed to be unanswerable. Its grammar was a guillotine. They wheeled out boxes marked with meticulous, bureaucratic handwriting, the kind Matthias had once admired for its certainty, and set them upon a table. A magistrate unrolled a list. The men around him, clerks and guards, took turns naming the volumes. Section XV Local Petitions, folios 357. Section Chi Convent Correspondences 112. Ledger Series of Payments and Disbursements, boxes 4-6. Each item was punctuated with the crisp sound of a stamp and a clerk's obeying nod. Matthias kept low in the doorway. He could have moved among them, offered his authority as scribe, tried to forestall the destruction with procedural objections. But the scriptorium had taught him how the machinery of law favored the prosec. Paperwork could be made to do violence if applied in the right sequence. Instead he listened, and with each entry his chest tightened as if someone had looped a band of iron about it. It was not until the first book was set between two men and a torch was offered that the ritual became final. Paper blistered, binding blackened. The first flame caught deep in the gutter where dust and old truth slept. Someone said, "For the preservation of order," and it was the wrong prayer. Matthias felt a sick, personal pang, an imagined line, two names from a ledger he had once touched burning. He had hidden one copy of the ledger in his satchel under cloth, and he realized now, with the peculiar horror of the negligent, that secrecy lived on acts as simple as having been awake. While the public ceremony of surrender and destruction proceeded, the scriptorium's backrooms became a battlefield in miniature. Thomas the messenger found Matthias after a half-hour, disheveled, breathless from running his routes. He had been stopped at an inspection point in the market. His satchel had been searched. He spoke with that rapid, clipped cadence that couriers acquire, the rhythm of listing roads and times. "They've diverted a palace wagon," Thomas said. "Crates bound for the river stores, someone has them now. Rumor is Varen's men took them to the south warehouse. Couriers at the southern gates are being searched. I had to ditch an envelope under a tray of onions to get here. She's been stopped twice. They slit her pack. They found nothing but her lunch. But they're taking lists, Matthias. They are asking for names." The phrase "asking for names" landed like a splinter. Matthias thought of the ledger in his bag and of the other copies they had placed with allies. He had believed at times that multiplicity was safety. Thomas' report showed him how naive such arithmetic could be. The state had not merely announced a purge. It had set nets in the city's channels, and the nets closed with an administrative skill that was nearly elegant. Edda found them before they could plan. She came in as if already carrying the air of a woman who had been stopped and searched. Her hair was bound tight. There was a smear of dust across one cheek. She moved with a careful energy, the kind of person who has learned to work in shadows but with steady hands. "They've got a list of couriers and their routes," she said without pause. "A partial manifest for the wagon that left the palace stores this morning. It was redirected. Varen's men tried to justify it as salvage of compromised materials. They filed a press notice. People are quiet because they want to stay alive, and because they don't know what to say." She unclipped a small roll and handed it to Matthias, a scrap with an address he knew too well: Sister Arnwin's convent. "They'll come for the convent," Matthias said, the words heavy. The convent had been a sanctuary, an awkward, pious enclave in the city's map, but for those who had sorrow to bury, it had been a repository of memory. If Varen's men took those volumes, the names would be gone more permanently than in the scriptorium's neat fires. They would be dispersed into smoky rumor, as if they had never been written. Sister Arnwin had accepted the risk of keeping forbidden folios in her little house of prayer, because the convent believed in a kind of immortality of texts, not a formal state immortality, but a persistent human one. To Arnwin, a ledger was a body of the dead. To Varen, a ledger was a nuisance to be filed away or extinguished. The difference between their philosophies had become lethal. The plan to circulate the ledger had been careful, perhaps too careful. They had relied on trusted couriers, on market sellers with pockets for letters, on men like Tumas who ran the arteries of the city. But nights accrued. The state had been patient. In wartime you learned that patience was a weapon. Now that patience had turned outward, and Matthias felt the strangling geometry of it. They met in a small chamber behind the scriptorium where stacks of paper lay in the dim. Jasper arrived as if summoned by the scent of alarm. He had a satchel, but his smile this morning was a little taut. "I can move copies," he said. "I can hide seams. But you must understand, authenticity is a marketplace. They will plant forgeries to discredit anyone who speaks. You need more than a ledger. You need a chain." Matthias could see the truth of Jasper's words in the sharpness of the man's eyes. A ledger without provenance was a corpse without name. People would say it had been planted. Jasper's own trade had taught him how easily truth could be mimicked. He offered to fabricate decoy folios that Varen's men might burn in public, to distract them, while the genuine pages were secreted away. It was a lie to protect the truth. Matthias' stomach twisted at the irony, but he accepted. They had little choice. Under the urgency of the day, they divided into teams. Edda would go to the convent with a small escort of quiet men. She would smuggle a cache of copies hidden within padded altar clothes. Sister Anwin would meet her halfway, with a chest of the convent's most fragile folios. Jasper and Matthias would work in a borrowed room near the river. He had a contact there with a press, an actual hand press. And the noise of the river could hide the whisper of the machines. Thomas would run as fast as he could, ferrying messages and small folios to the market sellers who had agreed to distribute copies like seeds. There was the practical matter of time. They had perhaps 3 days, perhaps less. The initial purge had been ceremonious, public, but Varen's men moved with a private appetite. They would inspect and seize what they had not yet shown. They would question couriers, open trunks, bribe porters. The city had not forgotten how to fear, and all fear bent into the chancellor's hands like soft metal. When they left the scriptorium, the sun had shifted to its lean and cowardly angle. They walked on separate errands, their faces plain, carrying small bundles concealed beneath coats. Matthias felt the weight of each folio like the weight of his forebears' faces at his shoulder. He told himself that what they carried was not merely paper but a possibility, that the ledger's names could survive and be remembered, that a public that read the names in unison might be forced to take a different breath. At the river, the rented room